we'd like to specifically talk about the introduction to this film.
Because it just feels like another example of the types of subtle manipulations that go on in this documentary.
So walk us through the beginning of the movie.
So I think the very beginning of the intro, we open with Giancarlo Esposito, popular character in Breaking Bad.
Plays Gus.
He
also has a good voice,
He has an amazing voice.
He probably picked up a good paycheck.
I hope he got a fat paycheck because that would be a blessing that this documentary has given to the world, is given Giancarlo Esposito a little something for his trouble. But even the fact that he does have this like charming, melodic, kind of intellectual sounding voice, the documentary begins by feeling very like a Planet Earth documentary. We've got sweeping landscapes, we've got visions of the universe,
time lapse in a desert. You can't have a UFO movie without a time lapse in a desert.
So it feels like something scientific. It feels like something with substance. But we quickly transition from the sort of nature scientific feeling to a pretty extreme escalation in terms of content.
Yeah. Before even that, we get some illusions of what's to come with Dr. Steven Greer.
Is this when he's walking through the halls?
That's after the intro, but this is when we're sort of getting the B-roll of the proof.
Yes.
Post-it note that's just stuck to something, which again, even though I have many issues with Dr. Steven Greer, I find it very charming that he would write proof on a Post-it note and stick it to something, as if his entire archive would not be the suggestion of proof. But anyway, so after the opening, we transition to the film's credits, which are accompanied by a lot of things.
Yeah, begin trauma montage.
Yeah, it is a bit of a trauma montage. The thing that really messes me up is when I first watched this movie, I thought I was getting into just like an alien movie. Like, I'm gonna see, they show the tank man footage of the guy standing in front of the tanks. They show sometimes footage of people coming together, but they also show you a man shot in the head and killed in the streets, and his blood splattered across the pavement. And like, I have a pretty good stomach for stuff like that. I love horror movies. I love gory stuff. I've seen fucked up things on the internet more than enough times, but like, I was not prepared to see that.
No.
And it did make me feel really weird.
Unsettled.
It made me feel unsettled. You then see 9/11 footage, not only in the intro, but multiple times throughout the movie.
Especially in part 3.
In part 3, this could be a bit of a misremembrance, but I am pretty sure you see a plane crash into a building at least 5 times in this movie. Maybe 4 as a like conservative guess. But to me, the reason this intro is so troubling and like does make me feel weird even still when I watch it is like, it's already preying on your emotions.
Yes.
It's taking advantage of our pathos, and it's like it's making us open our hearts kind of.
Right.
But it's forcing you to.
It's drawing you in with the intellectualization of it feeling like Planet Earth, and then we're very suddenly politicized, which isn't something that I'm opposed to happening within an alien documentary. But specifically when you referenced the 9/11 footage, why do we have that specifically in this documentary? One, we're supposed to see Greer as the hero, so we have all of these events that wouldn't have taken place if only this information would have been revealed to the public sooner.
Right.
We would have the technology to bring world peace, to something like that. That has to be part of the message of that, of having all of those traumatic events. But secondarily, I don't understand why I'm seeing 9/11 so much. Like, is this documentary also saying that 9/11 was an inside job? Like, is it also... I mean, it goes back to what you were saying in terms of what are we supposed to be skeptical about? We're supposed to be skeptical about everything except for Greer And we have a lot of unrelated events.
You also see footage of starving, dying children.
Yes.
I think the reason this intro really bothers me is because if there is an embarrassment of riches of information, and if Steven Greer is really sitting on all this shit, it should be able to speak for itself. You shouldn't have to sort of manipulate the viewer's emotions to get them ready to receive this information.
Or you need to more specifically connect these images with the content. Like, tell me, what are you trying to tell me about 9/11 in relation to the aliens? Because I'm seeing it, but it's not clear to me.
Yeah. And again, I don't know how much we'll end up talking about part 3 of this movie, because our main interests lie in aliens and in the people talking about the aliens and in like how compelling certain pieces are and aren't. But I think a lot of this footage in the intro also sets up part 3's big push for like alternative energy and like alternative lifestyles. And part 3 of this movie reminds me of like the ending of a aggressively vegan documentary where it's like, if we all become vegan, the world's going to be okay in no time.
Problem solved.
And I feel like what this documentary says is like, if the government would just disclose those alien documents, there'd be no more war and no more hunger.
If they'd only let Steven Greer speak.
If someone was as brave as Steven, which
if
is
1%.
I just want to remind anyone who's seen the movie or is about to watch it for the first time, the opening line of the movie after the intro we just talked about is Steven Greer saying once again, his biggest regret is that no one is as brave as him, that no one has come forward to be as brave as him. Like that's what it all leads to.
Is that literally what he said? His biggest regret?
He says, my biggest regret in all these years of doing this is that if 1% of the people I've talked to would come forward, it would be a done deal.
Even
basically. Like,
rhetorically, that's a strange thing to say, that one's own regret can be something that he has no control of, that other people... Wow.
Yeah, it's like, man, my biggest regret in life is that people were mean to me. Nothing to do with me. Like,
my biggest regret is how much the rest of you don't have it going on and I do. Why can't you all be as great as I am?
Yeah. So I'd say that's mostly our thoughts on the introduction to the film.
It just sets up the widespread emotional manipulation and the lack of explanation that occurs throughout the entire documentary. So in that way, it's a very fitting intro and it's perfect.
The next thing I'd like to talk about is this film's use of quotations.
Which is one of the framing devices it uses. So we have the 3 sections, and the 3 sections are further interspersed with quotes, which is very freshman college English paper. Once again, you got to have your hook.
So I just want to say these aren't the quotes people say who are like interviewed in the movie. About every 10 minutes, there are 13 quotes overall. About every 10 minutes, the film will cut to Giancarlo Esposito reading a quote from a popular person. One of them is Shakespeare, but we'll get to that in a second. One of them is Harry S. Truman. One of them is Gorbachev. Like, just a lot of world figures. And I think the reason this jumped out to me is because a lot of times the wording of the quotes doesn't seem quite as like convincing. So like as an example of what I mean by this, the Harry S. Truman quote, this is the one that got me on this trail. It says, "I can assure you that flying saucers, given that they exist, are not constructed by any power on Earth." What about that quote seems weird to you? Does anything jump out to you about that quote?
Are you talking about the given that they exist?
Given that they exist. Like,
right.
To me, you could say, "Hey, Shane, what do you think about ghosts?" And I could say, "Well, I think ghosts, given that they exist."
Right.
Or whatever. Like, so that's the type of like thing that got me interested in hunting down each of these quotes and sort of looking at how the movie uses them. So I'm just going to go through one at a time. The first quote in the movie is a quote from William Shakespeare, and it says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." This quote is from Hamlet. I'm not the biggest Hamlet buff. I don't really like Shakespeare. But one thing I found interesting about this quote is it kind of personifies the film's weird relationship with skepticism. So from my understanding, Hamlet says this to another character when he's trying to convince them that he's seen the ghost of his father. And they're both educated men. And Horatio is saying, it's not real, whatever, who cares? And Hamlet says, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than you can even dream of, basically. So I just thought it was interesting that later in the play, Horatio does see evidence of Hamlet's ghosts that he's referencing, and then he believes in it. So in a way, the quote is saying, or of the context from the play, the character begins to believe something once he has seen evidence of it.
Right.
So it's almost like, I don't know. I just think this is an interesting quote to sort of begin the movie on, because Steven Greer at every step of the way is saying, don't believe this person or this interpretation of events, not often really giving evidence. He's saying, believe mine.
Right.
And I say, okay, Steven Greer, let's enter this bargain then. If you give me evidence, I will believe you. But it's never really given.
Right.
Like, there's some great testimonies that I find very compelling, but there's never sort of the big moment where I'm seeing a great video for a length of time, which Steven Greer claims to have.
And the major pieces of evidence that we did a little digging on seem to fall apart relatively quickly. Like, once again, we haven't fact checked every single piece of evidence here, but the Atacama humanoid misrepresented. The Guy Hotel document, at least in a certain capacity, misrepresented.
Yeah, so that's, and I'm not really attacking the documentary for using this quote, especially as the first one. I just think, again, if you really think about it and you think about this movie and how it uses information, this was just an interesting quote, to say the least, and it establishes a unique relationship with skepticism. So the second quote in the movie is Gorbachev saying, "The phenomenon of UFOs does exist, and it must be treated seriously." I was able to find that he said this quote in the early 90s, but I was never able to find an actual recording of it or an actual reporting of it. I did find some documents and some articles about both Reagan and Gorbachev being pretty freaked out about aliens. There are some people who think that Reagan was in contact with aliens and he was able to wrap up the Cold War in that sense. But one thing I want people to keep in mind when they see these quotes of basically figures saying, they often say that the phenomenon of UFOs exists. They aren't saying extraterrestrial life. They aren't saying aliens. They're saying this phenomenon exists. We've observed it happening. This isn't Gorbachev saying that the phenomenon equals aliens.
Right.
He could have thought it was an American craft. He could have thought it was a Chinese craft. Like, these quotes are put into the movie to be like, oh, there's another guy saying it's real.
Right, which isn't to say that we don't want to believe. It's just to say that this is another example of even the quotes that are used are being presented in a way that isn't entirely accurate to the source itself. So it's another reason of why we can't take Steven Greer as a documentarian seriously.
Which sort of leads me into the big problem that I encountered with this Gorbachev quote, that I encountered with the Truman quote, that I encountered with the John McCormick quote, and many others, the Gerald Ford quote as well, which I was able to track down. But many of these, the first Google results you get for them up to the third, fourth, or fifth page are like shitty quote websites, like ABC Quotes or A to Z Quotes or famousquotes.com or whatever. And it's like, okay, so when I Google this, if the first thing I'm getting isn't like an article or, I don't know, something that's not just a quote compilation website, where did Steven Greer get it? Because I'll tell you another thing. Some of these quotes are just cited in really fucking weird books that are only available as like ebooks through Google.
Right.
And it's like, okay, I'm not saying the quote never happened. maybe that guy has an audio recording of a press release.
But we're not talking about obscure figures. We're not talking. These aren't ufologists that only have these statements occurring in out of print books from the 80s or something. These are public figures. Like, theoretically, it should be relatively easy to track back to a significant quote.
And I for this Gorbachev quote specifically, I tried to track it down as far as I could. Again, I mostly I found one really interesting article from 1989 about a alien landing in Russia who was wearing bronze boots.
This is some good. This is good stuff.
He's wearing bronze boots, a disc on his chest, and like a skin tight spacesuit. Who went back inside his spaceship, then came back out, basically to wave to the humans, and had a robot present with him. I love it. I love the story. Still didn't find the Gorbachev quote in there. Another article I found was again about a meeting that Reagan and Gorbachev had in either the late 80s or early 90s, where apparently all these other delegates were sitting around in the main area, and Reagan and Gorbachev went off into the gardens to allegedly talk about UFOs. The closest thing I got to a citation on this was, again, a press conference from the early 90s that I was not able to get a text of or a recording of. So it may exist out there. But again, I just want people to keep in mind, this is the second quote of the film, the first main one after Shakespeare, and it's not easy to find a citation for it. And
it doesn't make the quotes not interesting. It doesn't make the quotes not worthy of some investigation. But again, this is his documentary about his archives, right? Like, this is important information. It needs to be held to a really high standard, and only being able to track these quotes back by and large to ABZ quotes or whatnot, that's not a high enough standard.
And what if, in Greer's archives, what if he has the audio recording of Gorbachev saying this?
Then give us the audio recording,
right?
Yeah.
That would be super cool. Which sort of leads me to the next quote, which is from Harry S. Truman, the one I already talked about, where he says, "I can assure you that flying saucers, given that they exist, are not constructed by any power on Earth." This quote had a very strange path of citation. It was in a book called Shoot Them Down, which kind of complicates where this comes from, because it's like there are a lot of authors in the UFO field, and again, I love the UFO field. I love learning more about kooky alien ideas, but I can't trust all of these people. And like, if one of the main places this quote pops up is just some weird book, then I'm kind of skeptical of it. Another unfortunate thing.
Well, if you're not going to give us the credibility of the source material itself, then don't just flop it into the documentary.
Yeah, and with this Harry S. Truman one, once again, what it ultimately boiled down to is that I think he said it in a press conference, and I want to say 1952. That was all I could find. I can't find a transcription of the press conference, and I can't find any audio recording of it. So once again, if this is something Greer has, and he's just presenting it off the cuff in his movie, narrated by Gus from Breaking Bad, I think a much more effective way to do it would be to include the actual audio or include the actual transcription. The film actually tries to cite some of these quotes at one point, and it forgets to remove the year. There's a quote from 1955 that then appears, that 1955 header appears on like the next two quotes, which could not have been said in the same year. So not really saying these quotes never happened, because I did find some perfectly reasonable citations for them after some scouring. But you'd think in a documentary, which let's revisit some of the phrases, an embarrassment of riches, right? This is all here and no one's paying attention to it. Can you not then just give us a citation? Like, do some due diligence, do the amount of work a freshman in college would have to do to get an A,
right? And
cite your fucking source,
right?
So, I do want to say one of these quotes, I was not able to access it because it was hidden behind websites that used reverse CAPTCHA stuff, which can basically like fuck up your browser and your computer. So again, not saying the quote isn't real, but it's hidden behind spyware.
It's weird that the only places you can track down information about where they came from are behind spyware. Like, that doesn't bode well.
So the fourth quote used in the movie is from John McCormick, Speaker of the House, Honorable John McCormick, and he says that I feel that the Air Force has not been giving out all available information on these unidentified flying objects. You cannot disregard so many unimpeachable sources. So I did find that this was in an interview in a magazine in the 60s called True Magazine, but the book that cited this, I couldn't find that magazine.
It's interesting. I just want to kind of jump in and say True Magazine is where I found the article written on, I think it's Silas Newton, which is the guy that people posit created the hoax that stemmed the Guy Hoddle document. Which is just to say that True Magazine must have been covering like a fair amount of
like UFO stuff. I found the True Magazine citation in a book called They Know, You Don't by Silviu Solita.
Great title.
Not much exists about the book that I can find, but I haven't had a chance to look through the whole thing. There is a huge PDF I found that I technically have not looked through, so the quote could be contained in here. But again, like...
Not easily accessible.
And again, if Greer is somehow sitting on these, can't you just show us a photograph of it?
Right.
It's clearly done in an interview of some kind.
Right.
It should be declassified information.
Right. Having it typed up into a PowerPoint presentation and read by someone else. And then not only that, but when you type it into Google, it isn't clear where and when it came from. Problematic.
Right. Not saying Greer got all these from abcquotes.com, but if you look these quotes up yourself, those will be the first places you find them. There's a part of me that wonders, did Greer get a little Google happy, alienquotes.com? Like
this one's good. We got to put this one in there.
Now this fifth quote is from Gordon Cooper, my man. Where he says, I believe that these ET vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets, which obviously are a little more technically advanced than we are here on Earth.
Which, once again, it's interesting that the quote, it's not consistent who and where the quotes are coming from. It might be Shakespeare. It might be a political figure from the Cold War era. Or it might be someone that's being interviewed in the documentary right here, right now.
I did find this quote he said to a United Nations panel in 1985. So that's actually where this quote came from. He also followed it up with, I feel like we need to have a top-level coordinated program to scientifically collect and analyze data from all over the Earth concerning any type of encounter and to determine how best to interface with these visitors in a friendly fashion. So I have no issues with these quotes from Gordon Cooper, though I will say the film's portrayal of him is a little bit odd. If you watch this movie with subtitles on Amazon, you'll get subtitles for the whole movie, except for the man who needs them the most, which is an old Gordon Cooper. And like, I love him. He's great. But you can't understand what he's saying at like kind of a critical part of the movie where people are being interviewed one after the other. Like everyone has subtitles except Gordon Cooper. Is that an oversight? Is it another just kind of juvenile mistake in this movie? I don't know, but just thought I would point that out. But yeah, I have no problem with these Gordon Cooper quotes.
I want to do more research into Gordon Cooper. So far, he seems to be like one of the most credible pieces of evidence included in this documentary. I think he has a lot of interesting things to say, and I would really love to find an unedited, uncut version of the interview that he has here, because I think, and once again, this is something we need to do more research on, but I think this is an interview that comes from elsewhere. It's not an interview.
Yeah, this is not one of the Steven Greer interviews.
Right. But I like Gordon Cooper. I think his opinions should be looked into a little bit more substantively, because his evidence feels like the most credible evidence that we have here.
Now this next quote from President Gerald Ford is one that I kind of like, because I think it's a good example of how these quotes are used to various effects throughout the movie, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I just think it's something viewers should be aware of. So Gerald Ford, the quote is, I believe the American people are entitled to a more thorough explanation than has been given them by the Air Force. I think we owe it to the people to establish credibility regarding UFOs and to produce the greatest possible enlightenment on the subject.
Definitely something that we can agree with, but there's a pretty problematic thing about this quote.
The thing about the quote is that, like, he's not actually saying he thinks that this evidence will lead to proving aliens. I think Ford's concerns are with, like, transparency and, like, the government. And I think he's saying, let's just research the fuck out of this and see what we come up with so that people can know what's going on. And, like, yes, that is concurrent with Greer's aims a little bit, but Gerald Ford isn't saying it's going to lead to aliens. He's saying the Air Force hasn't really told us enough. Let's just get this over with. I think Ford was much more concerned with remaining transparent with, like, civilians than he was searching for aliens. Again, not saying that makes this quote dumb or that it shouldn't be used, but I just think that Ford's aims are being misrepresented a little bit.
This next quote, if you're finished, are you finished?
I'm finished with that one.
This next quote, I think, is amazing because of how juicy it is, but also how little there is to it.
Yeah. So this next quote says, "Of course the flying saucers are real, and they're interplanetary. Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding."
Case closed.
Case closed, right? Well, let's see where this shit comes from. So, once again, this quote only exists as far as I can find as cited in some more weird alien books. So there's another one, They Know, You Don't. There's another book called The UFO Book of Lists, and another book called UFOs in the Year of the Dragon. The issue with this quote, though, is that one of them cites the quote as being stated in 1952. The other quotes it as being stated in 1954, and neither of them gives a place where the quote can actually be found. We don't know if it's from a press conference. We don't know if it can be verified. And, like, I just have this worry about these weird books. Like, I don't know who wrote them, and you can make a lot of money in the UFO field.
Well, that's kind of why we need documentaries, if not by Greer, by someone else, because the problem with some of the UFO source material itself is that it hasn't been vetted. So we kind of need another filtering process in the similar way of what this documentary is trying to do, to go a layer deeper to see what the credibility or validity of these quotes are. They can't themselves be used as an unimpeachable source. They're a piece that can be used as a springboard to dig a little deeper to say, is this evidence that we can put in the pile of not debunked alien information, which I think is what we are ultimately searching for. Is we don't think that we can find the proof out there on the internet. Otherwise, it would already exist. But we can do is kind of filter through the evidence that can't be out and out discounted. And that's what I want when I watch a documentary like Steven Greer's documentary, is give me the information that when I start scratching the surface, I can't immediately find it to be pretty bullshit.
And don't you think that if disclosing UFO information is your life's work,
yes,
wouldn't you care a little more about making sure we know where sources come from?
Right.
I'm going to draw a quick illusion that I might cut out of this podcast, but I'm going to draw it to a project that I've been working on for a long time, which is a blog about a game called Mother 3. And I got the inspiration for writing this blog on a quote that actually doesn't exist. I'd made it up in my memory, or I had believed someone who cited it on a website, which is basically, in short, I had heard that a game developer designed a game so that anyone from ages like 5 to 75 could complete the game because you could play it in 5-minute increments. I have never been able to find that exact quote. I've been able to find quotes similar, but I've never been able to find the quote I was 100% certain had existed. You know why? Because I care about the subject, and I tracked it down for a fucking year, and I found out I was wrong. That quote doesn't exist. Something similar exists, but not the exact thing. And I'm just thinking, if Greer's life's work is disclosing UFOs, and I can't find where the fuck these quotes are from, like...
That's a problem.
That's a problem to me.
That's what makes him seem like a charlatan, and that's not good enough. That's not a high enough standard.
Yeah.
To be putting out documentaries that are going to the public. And when you do that, and when it becomes so flagrantly obvious that you're pulling from crummy sources, then you've done a disservice to this thing that you're claiming to care so much about. If you, like you were saying, if you care so much about the topic, then you have to hold yourself to an immaculate standard. Or you're doing it to pat your own self on the back and run the Steven Greer show.
Or it's a lazy film. And
Yeah.
like, I think a lot of these things, you know, I don't always want to be painting Steven Greer as this like deliberate bad guy. I don't know who even put these quotes in the movie, but it's just like, this is your life's work, et cetera, et cetera. You would think you would vet your own project a little bit. They misrepresent the year on multiple quotes because someone on that editing timeline did not remove the 1955 header they put on the fucking quote. I still can't believe that. But anyway, the eighth quote of the movie I'm actually going to come back to because it's by a guy named Victor Marchetti. And he is actually really, really fascinating. And I like that his quote is included in the film, and I have no issues really with it, except for a couple misrepresentations. But we'll get back to him. I'm going to jump ahead to the ninth quote from good old Jimmy Carter, which is, I am convinced that UFOs exist because I've seen one. So this is actually
President Jimmy Carter.
This is actually kind of fun to dig into. There is an entire Wikipedia page about Jimmy Carter's UFO incident. It occurred before he was president. He was at either some sort of event or some sort of party, and he saw a light off in the distance, and it was hovering and it would move around. He claims multiple other people saw it. He also promised on his campaign trail that when he became president, that he would like focus on disclosure for UFO stuff. After he became president, he sort of flip-flopped on that and said he couldn't because of defense implications. So, you know, he kind of did us dirty there. The interesting thing I'll say about this Jimmy Carter UFO incident is that a lot of people who were also at the event just said nothing like that happened. Apparently, he even gave the incorrect month for when the event took place. The weather he described for how it should have been at the time of year he was there was all off. I'm not saying this discredits the entire thing. I'm actually super interested in the fact that Jimmy Carter saw an alien.
Okay, I've seen a documentary that I can't recall the title of right now, but the premise is a son somewhere probably around his 30s and his disabled father are kind of hitting the road to research aliens, and there's a scene in that documentary where they go to a book signing by Jimmy Carter and they ask him about it. In that moment, he says, I've seen a UFO. So I have seen footage of Jimmy Carter claiming to have seen UFOs. I don't know what this means for this particular quote, but I'm just saying I've seen footage of Jimmy Carter himself claiming that.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily have any like problems with this quote. I just think it's kind of funny that like not only is Jimmy Carter sure he's seen an alien, but like there's a whole Wikipedia article about it. I just think is great. So yeah, this quote isn't really one that I have any issues with.
Once again, does it need to be in the documentary, especially just as a flip thing that's been lobbed into it? Maybe not. It's not the worst thing that's in the documentary, but it's certainly not astoundingly perfect evidence.
And this next quote is just another example of kind of a sketchy citation issue. But this one says, it is time for the truth to be brought out. Behind the scenes, high-ranking officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. I urge immediate congressional action to reduce the dangers from secrecy about unidentified flying objects. Former CIA Director Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. No problems with this quote. I think, though, once again, it's the movie taking something from someone in a position of power who's a little bit more concerned with government secrecy. I also found out that this quote was most recently cited in a book called Aliens from Space, which was published in 1975. And one interesting thing I will circle back to when I talk about Victor Marchetti is the 70s were a big decade for people learning about like what the fuck the CIA really was for like the first time.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people were concerned with the amount of transparency that the government did or did not have with civilians. So again, not saying there's really anything wrong with this quote. I don't love the citation situation, how it's from a book from the 70s and like I don't have much else other than that. But I do think it's one of about 4 or 5 quotes that seems like the person talking is really saying, I'm uncomfortable with this level of secrecy. Let's be more transparent with like civilians.
And I think, to be fair, that's one of the things I agree with what you're saying in terms of how it's used in the documentary and how it's once again just an example of credibility of a person being used as evidence for the existence of aliens overall, because it's being misrepresented because it's actually speaking to the fact that they're against government secrecy. But if you're out there and you don't believe in aliens, I think that's definitely one of the best arguments for why UFOs need to be taken seriously, because it's a situation where it's like, if not this thing, another thing. And I think if it's the other thing, we do need more transparency. It seems pretty crazy that these government institutions coded in secrecy do appear to exist, and that feels like a problem. Yeah.
And so that quote I don't have issue with the content. Don't love the citation situation. Now the 11th quote is another one I think is pretty fine. It's just a guy. This was spoken at an academic conference, I think in Colorado, from what I remember. And he just says, I must admit that any favorable mention of the flying saucers by a scientist amounts to extreme heresy and places the one making the statement in danger of excommunication by the scientific theocracy. I think this is a perfectly fine quote to put in there. I think it's probably true that like once a scientist starts talking about UFOs, like people kind of take it as an opportunity to like jump on them. I can't remember what it was I was watching recently. Oh, I was watching I'll have to look up the title of this later, but I was watching a kind of Planet Earth ripoff that's narrated by Will Smith.
I remember you telling me about this.
One thing I thought was really weird about this movie is that like when it did approach the topic of aliens, it was like not a chance. It was like, we can look at all these other Earth-like planets, but don't worry, dear viewer, like no chance there's aliens. And then it cuts to Will Smith and he's like, yo, trust me, there's no aliens, not a chance at all. Yeah, like it's very, very dismissive, kind of like for no reason. And so I do think I kind of like quotes like this.
That's suspicious.
It is a little suspicious.
It's making me think of the Neil deGrasse Tyson interview with Joe Rogan, where not that I'm using Joe Rogan as an unimpeachable source. That's like, it's just whatever you're thinking right now, just table it, because that's not what it's about. What it's about is this person who is a scientist, who is seen by the general public as being a good, reputable source on scientific things. When the topic of aliens is brought up, just fully just like blam, shuts it down. There's nothing that can or should be said about it, and that feels a little weird.
Yeah. And in that regard, I am on Steven Greer's side, and I hope we can uncover this shit.
The end of this is just us agreeing with Steven Greer and joining his fan club.
But the next quote was one of my favorites and something I learned quite a lot about. So I'm not really sure what's going on with the whole Lockheed Skunk Works thing, but from what I can tell, they're just some crazy company that develops wild technology, whether for military use or maybe future commercial use. I think they were involved with the invention of the stealth bomber, which many people think was a lot of UFO sightings that ended up being stealth bomber or similar technology.
Specifically the Phoenix sighting.
Yeah, the Phoenix sighting. However, Ben Rich, I learned, was an incredibly interesting guy. For one, Ben Rich was the person I was talking about, to where you know how when you Google something, you see the link and then you see some like preview text of what it is. one of his quotes was being debated. I could just tell through that preview text. But anytime I tried to click on any of those links, I got reverse captured, and I didn't want to get a fucking virus. And so I didn't deal with it. So I learned a few things about Ben Rich. He is misquoted all the time, to the point that I know someone listening to this show is probably not going to have the best relationship with Wikipedia. I'm not telling you to have the best relationship with Wikipedia, but there is a quote section for Ben Rich in which Wikipedia editors debate the legitimacy of some of his quotes.
Interesting.
So I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. I then found a podcast where a guest on the show had interfaced with Ben Rich on a few different occasions and actually got to see his speeches. So the quote in the movie is this: "We now have the technology to take E.T. home." I want to point out this quote is misattributed to being spoken in 1955 because someone did not remove the header from the thing. This quote was actually said in the 90s. So here's what I learned about this quote. One, Ben Rich apparently would often give speeches to the public or to investors to kind of explain what money they'd gotten for their next technological push and how it was going to be used. But he was always, in this person said he was frustrated about this. He couldn't really say what they were doing, which turned him into someone who would make a lot of jokes. And he would write his own speeches down to like every last line. That's how he liked to give speeches. He would write them out. And the quote apparently is more of a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing of like, we're working on something, that, it's going to be able to take ET off the, you know what I mean? But that's not actually what they were working on. He was cited as being a guy with a great sense of humor who would often make humor because of the frustration of his position. So in that regard, we don't really know what the hell was meant by the ET comment. One, I know this, it's misrepresented in the movie itself. I'll include a link in the YouTube description. You can listen to it. It's 5 minutes of audio about where this quote actually came from, and what the quote might have actually been. This person guesses again. It was kind of just a almost frustrated joke. And that's really all it is. Ben Rich was not saying we have the technology to travel in space. He was not saying we have the technology to take an alien to a different planet. He was probably making a joke saying, we're working on some stuff. Who knows?
Right.
Could be taking ET to his home planet. It was a joke. And that's...
It's a weird thing to put on your alien documentary where you say there's an embarrassment of riches proving aliens to 100% be real.
And also, this is, even though many quotes in this movie don't have a solid citation, this is one that not only has no solid citation, but is also completely misrepresented. A person who, again, was kind of like an assistant to Ben Rich said he never said this.
Wow.
Or at least said this in this way. I want to be clear. He did make an ET joke, apparently during a speech, but he did not say we now have the technology to take ET home. So... I thought this quote was very interesting. I would love to do more research on Ben Rich in the future. But now I'll move to the 13th quote, which is from General Douglas MacArthur. This is a good one. The nations of the world will have to unite for the next war, or the nations of the world will have to unite. For the next war will be an interplanetary war. The nations of Earth must someday make a common front against attack by people from other planets. This quote is not real.
Wow.
That's what I found. Snopes fact check was never spoken. The closest thing someone said is that they had a personal conversation with MacArthur about what types of weapons might be used in a potential World War III. And MacArthur surmised we don't even know yet. We might not know what those weapons are. MacArthur never said this or anything like it, apparently. So,
which... Okay, so two options are possible. Either you are correct,
right,
and the documentary is just patently using a fake quote, which that's bad. Or they didn't research a quote they believe to be real for the fact that the large populace or the overall consensus is that this quote is not real. If they were aware of that, and they want to use this quote because they believe it to be real, the onus is absolutely on them to dig deeper into the quote to give us the reasons why this quote is credible. You cannot then just fling it into your documentary when there's evidence out there to the contrary. It is then your responsibility to address that. It's bizarre to include it otherwise.
Yeah, and again, like I wouldn't be surprised if someone watching this video does not really like Snopes and maybe sees it as something not to be trusted, in which case I don't want to question your right to question Snopes, but I just want to say to the point you just made, if there's an embarrassment of riches, why not
read this quote?
Why not pull from the embarrassment of riches?
Right.
Like,
either address the fact that people say it's possibly false, or don't use it. Use the embarrassment of riches.
But now we do have a bit of an embarrassment of riches. The last quote, which I'm going to circle back around to. So I actually found this person.
What is that cliche, like a broken clock is always right twice a day?
Yes. So this quote is definitely the broken clock.
We're throwing you a boner, Greer.
So I'm first going to read the quote as it's presented in the documentary, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the quote. So this is from Victor Marchetti, who was the former special assistant to the executive director of the CIA. And he says, "We have indeed been contacted, perhaps even visited, by extraterrestrial beings. And the U.S. government, in collusion with the other national powers of the Earth, is determined to keep this information from the general public." So the first thing I'd like to tell you is there is technically an omission from this quote. I don't think it changes it too much, but I just think people should know.
And it is an interesting decision by...
It's an interesting decision. So the quote does not start with, "We have indeed been contacted." It starts with, "I suspect we have indeed been contacted." Again, not a huge difference. But
that's an editorial decision by Greer or whatever, Greer's team, to remove the words "I suspect." Why? Because it doesn't suit their aim, which makes them suspicious.
Mm-hmm. However, Victor Marchetti is super fucking interesting. I never knew about him. So for one, this quote is verifiable. There's a magazine from the 70s called Second Look. It's I wouldn't call it the most legitimate magazine I've ever looked at. I looked at a few issues of it that I could find online, and there was some very science fiction looking stuff going on.
But to be fair, this type of information is not taken very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So it is, we have to say that if we're looking into this stuff, that's where this information is going to be, because those are the places that are going to publish it. So, and that's part of what makes any investigation into this type of stuff difficult. And
here's the fun part. So Victor Marchetti is actually one of the first, like, kind of what we would now call a whistleblower. So he came out, he was the first book, other than like some other random thing that wasn't as notable, that the government went out of its way to censor. So Victor Marchetti wrote a book about his time in the CIA. And when he attempted to publish it, the CIA basically like sued him. And this book went through and in and out of courts for like over a year. At one point, the CIA was going to omit over 300 sentences from the book. Then they cut it down to like 80. Then they bumped it back up to 180. So like, I think Victor Marchetti is someone we should be paying attention to.
And I think that's a really good example of good, quote unquote, evidence for either alien or government cover-up, because the CIA would not be interested in expurgating this book if they didn't have some motivation for why they didn't want that cut information out there. And that itself speaks to the credibility of this quote, this person, this research.
Right. And so we're going to include all our sources in the video description of this video, and I would highly recommend people read this, because Victor Marchetti does talk about things that we know a lot more about now. One of which is that in the 60s, like prominent like black people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were targeted by the CIA. We know a lot more about this now. We don't have like the full picture, but we do know that it basically happened. And he's talking about this in the 1970s. He also says that while he can't speak like conclusively about aliens, that from what he knows about the inner workings of the CIA, it has all the telltale signs of a cover-up. It's not to say it necessarily does, but from Victor Marchetti's position, someone who worked intimately on various levels of the CIA, he says he thinks it looks like a cover-up as far as he's seen them done. The other thing I would say that I found to be terrifying is that, let's see. So I'm just going to read this quote out. On paper, the CIA employs 16 to 18,000 people on a budget of $750 million per year. Actually, the budget is far higher because the CIA owns and runs many companies around the world which make money, like Air America, the airline involved in the heroin trade in Southeast Asia. Then there's the Alumni Association that links perhaps as many as 100,000 people into the intelligence net. He goes on to say that if there's a community like aliens, or the example he gives is the American Communist Party, that at least 20% of the members in them, he says 1 out of 5 members are CIA operatives, which goes into something we're not going to get into today, but Richard Doty.
Doty.
I can't believe we haven't mentioned him already.
Doty, we're coming for you.
We're not going to get too much into it now, but just there's a guy named Richard Doty who appears in this movie who used
and he is one of the interviewees that is original content to this documentary.
Who's at this point now well known, was once a disinformation agent.
Admittedly, he himself has admitted that.
And he even admits that like some popular perceptions of UFOs that still persist to this day all come from disinformation campaigns. So anyway, I'm not going to read through the entire Marchetti thing, but I'll include the link above. I think he's a super interesting guy, kind of the original CIA whistleblower. The one thing I think to always keep in mind, because I want to have a healthy relationship with skepticism for our show. So what I would tell people is that like Victor Marchetti himself admits that like even he isn't totally sure what was real and what was not within the CIA. One thing he cites is that, let's say I sent you on like an intel mission and you give it to your boss. He said on more than one occasion he would see people just throw things away.
Whoa.
It was just to keep people working and thinking certain things were real. He also says that when the government says that they have to censor things because of security, he claims the CIA and the KGB and MI6 from the UK or whatever, that they work together all the time and largely know each other's secrets and have plants within each other's agencies all the fucking time. He said one time within 5 days of an operation being started in America, the KGB already knew about it and had a full disclosure on it. So like when people say things aren't being disclosed for like public safety, that's also a bit of a tricky concept because other countries and their information organizations probably already know about them. So this was my, I think, favorite thing I learned from this documentary, in which case I'll say it's probably the most compelling thing that I took from it was Victor Marchetti.
Yeah, so we should do a deeper dive on Marchetti.
Yeah, and you know, if anyone was kind of upset about some of those quotes, this is one I think is okay to hold on to. Just remember that again, even though it was just 2 words, they did present it differently.
Right, so
from
even
its original context.
Even in some of the most credible, best supportive evidence that Greer gives, he still finds a way to make the way he's giving it to us suspicious.
Hello, fellow humans. Shane here again, just saying thank you for watching our second video on Unacknowledged, Part 3. The final part will be coming out within the next week or so, so please like and subscribe so that you don't miss that video. Leave us a comment below if you agree or disagree with our perspectives on this movie. We are always approaching this type of material and the personas in it with an open mind, so feel free to disagree with us. Feel free to let us know something you've learned about Greer or any of his witnesses, or even perhaps a better citation for any of the quotes that I read in this episode. Once again, Part 3 will be coming out within the next week or so, which will finish this series on Unacknowledged. And if you'd like more content about aliens or Greer or whatever, I would encourage you to go check out our Gaia series, where we discuss in a bit more of a casual setting the latest Steven Greer series called Disclosure, which has been streaming on Gaia. If that interests you, feel free to go check it out. Thanks again, guys, and remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thanks so much.